What if the person sitting next to you in the quietest corners of the world, at a bar, on a bus, even in your own neighborhood, was a monster, a predator, cloaked in an unassuming mask, hiding in plain sight, waiting to strike? Imagine you're walking home alone, the night air cold, when a stranger appears. They offer help, a ride, an invitation. What happens next will send chills down your spine. And yet, it's happening every day without us knowing. This is the horrifying reality of Jeffrey Dahmer, a man whose unassuming presence disguised an unimaginable terror. For years, Dahmer operated in the shadows, luring his victims into his apartment, drugging them, and subjecting them to unspeakable horrors: murder, dismemberment, necrophilia, and even cannibalism. The sheer brutality of his crimes was hidden in plain sight. He seemed just like any other person until you got too close, and then it was already too late. From 1978 to 1991, Dahmer terrorized the streets of Milwaukee, leaving a trail of pain, unanswered questions, and unspeakable acts. But behind every dark corner, there's a light. There's always a trail, a piece of evidence, a moment where the truth can no longer be ignored. Tonight, we uncover the chilling reality of the Milwaukee Cannibal, a man whose actions remain etched in the annals of American horror. We'll delve into the twisted mind of a killer who hid behind a mask of normalcy, until he was unmasked, revealing a nightmare that the world could never forget. This is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, and it's far worse than you can imagine. It started with a missing person, yet another young man who had vanished from the streets of Milwaukee without a trace. The police had seen this pattern before, but each case was a dead end. Young men of color, often from disadvantaged backgrounds, simply disappeared, leaving behind nothing but faint leads and the growing sense that something sinister was at play. But in the early 1990s, the case would take a turn, one that would unravel a nightmare. On May 27, 1991, a desperate man stumbled into a police station bloodied and frantic. His name was Tracy Edwards, and he had narrowly escaped the clutches of a killer. Edwards, who had been lured to Dahmer's apartment with the promise of money, had managed to free himself when Dahmer, drunk and distracted, had left him momentarily. Edwards was shaking with fear, his eyes wide, as he recounted the horrors he had just narrowly survived. He told the police that a man had tried to kill him, that there were disturbing photos, strange smells, and worse, a room that looked more like a butcher's slaughterhouse than a living space. Edwards led officers to the apartment, and what they discovered in that small, dingy unit would forever change the course of the investigation. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as they stepped deeper into the apartment, the truth began to surface, a nightmare cataloged in grisly detail. In Dahmer's bedroom, investigators found a blood-soaked mattress, photographs of dismembered bodies, and gruesome evidence of the most unspeakable acts. But it was the smell, sickening, putrid, that told the full story. Dahmer's apartment reeked of death, of decay. The investigators soon discovered human remains, skulls, bones, and body parts, carefully preserved in jars and plastic bags. It was a scene that would haunt those who saw it forever. The pieces fell into place. Edwards' account aligned with the evidence, and Dahmer's masked identity as an unassuming quiet man began to crack. But still, the police had no idea the scale of the horror they were about to uncover. Dahmer's arrest would lead them to the truth. A serial killer operating in plain sight, hiding in the shadows, choosing victims who wouldn't be missed. As they combed through his apartment, they found it, his collection. It wasn't just the bodies, it was the trophies. In his freezer, they found remains of body parts, meticulously cut and preserved. They even discovered a human head in the refrigerator. Dahmer had kept trophies from each of his victims, treating their dismembered bodies as objects to collect, to control. But the worst discovery came when they found photographs of the dismemberment. Chilling images that revealed just how methodical, how cold Dahmer's crimes truly were. Yet, even with all the evidence before them, the question remained: how had Dahmer gotten away with this for so long? How had the police missed the signs? And just how many lives had he claimed in the darkness of his apartment, where the world could never see the evil festering inside? The investigation was far from over, and as more victims were discovered, the full scope of Dahmer's depravity began to emerge. But the nightmare was only beginning. Behind every statistic, every chilling headline lies a life. A person with hopes, dreams, and a future stolen away. The true horror of Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror is not just in his brutal acts, but in the stories of the victims he claimed. Their lives, their humanity, were lost to a man who saw them as little more than prey. Each victim was lured under the guise of an offer, a promise, whether it was money, companionship, or simply a place to stay. And with every victim, Dahmer grew bolder, more confident in his ability to carry out his twisted fantasies without fear of being caught. Stephen Hicks, 18 years old, was the first. In June 1978, Dahmer spotted him hitchhiking on a quiet road in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Stephen accepted Dahmer's offer for a ride, unaware that the man beside him was anything but ordinary. What followed was the beginning of a series of horrific murders. Dahmer bludgeoned Stephen with a dumbbell, strangled him, and dismembered his body, keeping the remains as trophies. Stephen's family would never know what happened to him, as his body remained hidden for years. Over the next 13 years, Dahmer would claim more victims, mostly young men of color, often from marginalized communities. Many were vulnerable, living on the fringes of society, and often lured to Dahmer's apartment under the false promise of companionship or money. The list of victims includes Raymond Smith, 32, Richard Guerrero, 25, and Edward Smith, 27, all men who, like so many others, vanished without a trace. Dahmer's manipulation and charm made him an invisible threat, able to lure his victims into his grasp without suspicion. But it wasn't just the men who were targeted. Dahmer's spree also included Konorak Synthesomphone, a 14-year-old boy who was drugged and left for dead in Dahmer's apartment. Konorak managed to escape, wandering into the street, disoriented and partially naked. His cries for help were ignored by passers-by, and Dahmer was able to convince the police that the boy was his lover, that the injuries were the result of a domestic dispute. They let him go, sealing the boy's fate. Dahmer's brutality escalated as the years went on. In some cases, he kept his victims alive for days, subjecting them to unspeakable torture. He didn't just kill them, he tried to turn them into his own twisted creations. He drilled holes into their skulls, injecting acid and boiling chemicals into their brains in a grotesque attempt to create living zombies, individuals he could control and keep by his side forever. The names of Dahmer's victims, often forgotten by the public in the wake of his infamous crimes, tell the story of innocent lives taken far too soon. Their stories should be remembered, not as victims of a monster, but as people with names, families, and futures stolen in the darkness of a man's depravity. The arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer was not the culmination of a straightforward investigation, but the unraveling of a monstrous secret that had been hidden in plain sight for over a decade. On May 27, 1991, when Tracy Edwards bravely escaped from Dahmer's apartment and led police back to the scene, no one had any idea of the horrors that awaited them. Edwards, bloodied and terrified, described a man who had tried to kill him in an apartment filled with photographs, disturbing paraphernalia, and a room that reeked of death. But the officers who responded that night had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most grotesque and chilling crime scenes in American history. When they first arrived, nothing seemed out of place. Dahmer was calm, almost eerily so, and at first glance, the apartment appeared ordinary. But as the officers began to inspect the rooms, they quickly realized something was deeply wrong. They found a disturbing collection of photographs, gruesome images showing Dahmer's previous victims dismembered and posed in horrific ways. These were not just casual snapshots. They were deliberate, calculated reminders of the lives Dahmer had taken and the twisted control he had exerted over them. Then they stumbled upon the real evidence, the human remains. In Dahmer's refrigerator, they found body parts, human hearts, flesh, and severed limbs. Inside the kitchen, police discovered 2 human heads, each meticulously cleaned and preserved. In the bathroom, a severed head lay in a pot, evidence of Dahmer's gruesome acts of dismemberment. These were not random, impulsive killings. They were methodical, calculated, and deeply disturbing. Dahmer had not just killed his victims. He had taken their bodies and turned them into trophies, objects of his twisted obsession. As the police continued their search, they found more evidence of Dahmer's depravity. A barrel in the corner contained the remains of his latest victim, freshly dismembered. And scattered throughout the apartment were bags and jars containing even more body parts carefully stored for later. There were bones, skulls, and human organs, testament to the years of unspeakable acts Dahmer had carried out without being caught. The apartment reeked of decay, of death, of a life lived in absolute darkness. The moment Dahmer was taken into custody, investigators began to realize the full extent of his crimes. They learned of his twisted fantasies, the urge to dominate, to control, and to keep his victims forever by his side. Dahmer's confession, in which he admitted to killing 17 young men and boys over the course of 13 years, was chilling in its calmness. He spoke matter-of-factly, describing how he would drug, strangle, and dismember his victims. His nonchalance, his lack of remorse, was perhaps the most disturbing part of it all. But even as the truth came out, the questions kept piling up. How had Dahmer managed to fly under the radar for so long? How had he evaded suspicion for years while living among the very people he was murdering? The answer, chillingly, was that he had become a master of deception. He had learned how to hide in plain sight, blending into society while carrying out his horrific crimes behind closed doors. His charm and unassuming appearance had allowed him to prey on vulnerable young men, individuals who were often ignored by those around them. The revelation of Jeffrey Dahmer's identity sent shockwaves through the community. The quiet, shy man with the unremarkable appearance, the man who had lived next door to so many, was a monster. And the nightmare was far worse than anyone could have imagined. To understand the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer, one must delve beyond the horrific acts he committed and explore the complex psychological factors that drove him to kill. Dahmer's upbringing, his isolation, and his unrelenting desire for control shaped him into one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. What began as a lonely childhood evolved into an insatiable urge to dominate and possess. But what was it that truly motivated Dahmer to turn his disturbing fantasies into brutal reality? Born in 1960, Dahmer's early life was marked by neglect and emotional abandonment. His parents' tumultuous marriage created an unstable environment, and the young Dahmer was often left to fend for himself. His father, a chemist, was focused on his career and distant, while his mother suffered from mental health issues and chronic instability. Dahmer's childhood was isolated and devoid of warmth, leading him to retreat into a world of fantasy and compulsive behavior. Dahmer's early interests hinted at a darker side. As a young boy, he became fascinated with dead animals, collecting their remains and dissecting them. This morbid curiosity would later evolve into a fixation with human bodies. Dahmer himself later admitted that the dismemberment of animals was his way of exploring control, of creating something he could hold on to. This desire for control, of life, of death, was to become a hallmark of his criminal activities. At the age of 14, Dahmer began to exhibit troubling signs of his emerging psychopathology. The death of his parents' marriage, combined with his increasing social isolation, left him alienated from the world around him. As he entered adulthood, his sexual fantasies grew more deviant and dark. Dahmer described an intense need to have complete control over his victims, not just in life, but in death. He sought to create a perfect companion, someone who would never leave him, never resist him, someone who would be entirely his to dominate. His early murders were impulsive, driven by his need to feel power and control. However, over time, his methods became more calculated. Dahmer experimented with drugs to sedate his victims, rendering them docile, and then, after killing them, he would dismember their bodies, keeping pieces as trophies. His ultimate goal was not just murder. It was to turn his victims into his own twisted version of immortality, creating a collection of body parts he could preserve and control. Dahmer's lack of remorse, his cold demeanor during confessions, and his methodical approach to killing suggest a profound disconnect from empathy or any moral framework. His inability to form healthy human relationships and his overwhelming need for domination were central to his motive. In his mind, the only way to achieve closeness, to conquer the deep loneliness he felt, was through absolute control. Control that could only be obtained by eliminating the will of his victims. In the end, Dahmer's crimes were not just the result of mental illness, but the manifestation of a tortured psyche, twisted by years of neglect, isolation, and an insatiable thirst for power. His actions were driven by a terrifying need to possess and control life itself, transforming his victims into objects he could dominate, a grotesque attempt to fill the emotional void that consumed him. Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror left an indelible mark on the world, a horrifying reminder of the darkness that can hide behind an ordinary facade. His crimes, as chilling as they were, raise unsettling questions about the nature of evil. How does someone, seemingly so unremarkable, become capable of such monstrous acts? And more terrifyingly, how many others like him may be lurking in the shadows, hidden behind masks of normalcy, waiting for their moment to strike? In the end, Dahmer's capture and subsequent confession did little to ease the pain of the families left behind. 17 lives were lost, their stories erased, by a man whose obsession with control and power destroyed everything in its path. The trauma of his actions ripples through generations, leaving scars that will never fully heal. Though Dahmer is gone, the nightmare he left behind will never be forgotten. His case serves as a stark warning that evil, in its most insidious form, often walks among us, quiet, hidden, and waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And as we reflect on the depths of his depravity, we must ask ourselves how much of the darkness remains hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Thanks for watching till the end. If you found this video intriguing, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below, and let's continue to uncover the truth behind the world's most chilling crimes together. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the darkest secrets often hide in plain sight. Until next time, thank you for being a part of Deadly Secrets.